Well, welcome everyone. Before we introduce, I would like to start us with a prayer. So would you please move the Holy Spirit. God, thank you for this group of open-hearted, open-minded people who come to these ancient stories with a longing and sense of hopeful possibility, that they're not just talking about ancient ideas, ancient people, ancient ways, but they touch each one of us so deeply, and they enliven us as much now as they ever have in times past. So make this time a rich one for us, enable us to listen deeply to one another, to share meaningfully, and to gain what it is that we need from this time of study. In Christ we pray. Amen. Okay, I will announce the people online, and then I'd like the table to just introduce, say your names who are here. So we have Ann Galebreath. I'm really good at pronouncing that now, Ann. Okay, I have to tell you, we're getting better, much better. Bertie Wiest, Harry and Kathleen Edwards, Carol and Jay Williams. We have Horty Childs and looks like half Bob Childs. Right. Marilyn Chambliss, hi Marilyn, and Boyce Baldwin so far. And then would you please scroll up?
Oatmeal.
No, you're here.
Barbara Hall, Sunny D. Avery, Joe Beck, Jane Worst, Marcia Ford, Teresa Roeder,
Ken Moore. Wonderful. And Pastor Dan. So, all right, our final study, session 8 in our study of the women of the Bible. And we are dealing with at least one of these that most of us probably, well, maybe haven't heard of. Certainly haven't studied before because there's only just a couple verses. But then there's, Tamar, Mary Magdalene, some more well-known characters there, at least somewhat in Tamar's case. But let's get into a little bit. So Joanna is one of those characters that's only mentioned twice in the entire Bible, and in Luke. So Luke introduces her here, and it's just a couple verses. He says very simply that she is the wife of this sort of prominent person, this man in Herod's court. Well, it doesn't quite say court, but he's got a position of prominence, okay? So she is in a position to benefit from that. She has gained something from that. She certainly has status. She certainly has money, okay? She has been connected, though, with Jesus somehow. And the story in just a couple verses tells us that she, like Mary Magdalene in this story, had some sort of infirmity that Jesus was able to heal. And in her connection to that, in her finding of that wholeness, of that healing, she found a deeper purpose and meaning for her life in following Jesus. Okay, she then becomes one of these women that is named specifically, that Luke names as being the supporters of the movement. So it's not just about men, it never has been. But the way Luke names it, it's easy to sort of, kind of gloss over this because we're not given a ton of details. So the next time we see Joanna is at the tomb when she, with Mary Magdalene, shows up and one other woman show up and find Jesus. Okay, and they are the first to, sort of, they go and they seek to bless him, and they share the news with the rest of the disciples. So the question then remains, we don't have a lot, but we do have this sense of that she had all that the empire had to offer. And yet somehow it did not make her whole. Her infirmity suggests that there was something missing that Jesus was able to meet. Do you see how much is communicated in just a few verses about who she is and what's meaningful? That all access to the riches and strength and power of empire do not necessarily mean that much. In fact, I think we know they don't mean anything, ultimately. So she discovers that. And the story leaves it open then. It's like, well, was it Jesus who was really able to see who she was? Was she someone that had to hide her infirmity the whole time? It was only when Jesus met her, or she met Jesus, that she was healed of her infirmity. Was she sort of like, I don't know, Franklin Roosevelt, who was able to hide his infirmity because of his position of privilege or with tact? Did she have to? These questions we're not clear on. But the sense is, the point of her story, it seems, is that there was something missing, even though she had access to it all. Okay, and she found that something in her relationship, her experience with Jesus. So we'll talk about some of that. Tamar. You've probably heard the story of Tamar. It's rough. It's a rough story. And I don't know if some of you kind of read forward, trying to get a better sense of where the story was going. It's simply not pretty. And the reason I say that is because Tamar's story, like the story of so many women in these types of king stories, it's incidental to the larger story of David. There's nothing in it that sort of suggests that it's about her. The things that happen to her are more about fulfilling that famous prophecy that Nathan makes in the chapter before. You may remember when Nathan tells that parable to David and then he turns it about and says, "You are the man." It's a very powerful stage or scene. And Nathan is basically informing David that you have called down calamity on your house, on the house of David, because of your handling of the Bathsheba situation, okay, and Uriah, her husband. So there's all of that intrigue behind, and then these stories that follow with Tamar, with Absalom, with Amnon, all these sons and relatives, they're all sort of illustrations of that fall of the house of David type stuff. I mean, it's not a complete fall, because if you carry it through, David successfully defends the throne. But it's these part of the story that we don't often think of. We think of David as just this, wonderful, the best king of Israel, right? This is a significant part of David's story that we don't always sort of directly connect, but it's a deep part of who he was. And so the whole story of Tamar happens within that falling from grace of David's house. But nonetheless, what we are given is you have a virgin daughter of a king. That king ends up being the one who enables her to be raped because he's tricked by his own son, Amnon. Okay? And when he takes her into the bedroom, she refuses at first because she knows what's going to befall her. And Amnon is too strong for her, overpowers her, and then, shuns her, sends her away, silences her. Absalom, her whole brother, Amnon is her half-brother. Absalom looks like he's standing up for her, but it's questionable. Because if you read forward, he takes care, like it's just later too. He says he avenges, he does kill Amnon, sorry, spoiler alert. He kills Amnon ostensibly for Tamar. But if you follow the story, what he uses it though, I know it makes us want to clap, but it's not just that. He is using that as a means to try to grab the throne, usurp the throne from David. It's all part of a greater plan. So it's not so pure when you read the rest of the story. So it leaves us with this really difficult story that doesn't lie flat and is all too common in the biblical record. A story of horrific violence toward a woman that is never quite fully addressed. And we'll look at some of how that, some of those dynamics. And so what some of the ways that Tamar was a woman yet of voice and strength and commitment in the face of all these things that were foisted upon her about which she had no control. I mean, it says that she was living desolate in Absalom's house afterwards. That could mean, a lot of different things, but isolated, cast aside, really barren. It's awful. It's awful. There's not really a clear sense of redemption for her, except a small note later that Absalom names one of his children Tamar after his sister. So it's a messy one, but we'll get into some of this and we'll see what the story does tell us about her and her strengths in that situation. And then the last one, of course, is Mary Magdalene. Look, she's the most misunderstood, mischaracterized person probably in all of Scripture, because why? We think of her as prostitute. We think of her as all these different things. And part of the reason for that, it's not Dan Brown, it's not all that stuff. It's the Scripture record itself. To say that she's from Magdala, it was a place that was sort of known as being of questionable virtue. It'd be sort of like saying, well, let's remember the woman from Samaria. the Samaritan woman. Samaria was a place of questionable virtue, depending on your perspective. If you're a Jew in the southern kingdom, yeah, but they didn't think of themselves that way. So it's probably the same dynamic here. You're having someone that's being culturally assessed from an outsider's perspective, but that's the reputation that Magdalene had. Okay. Then there's an unfortunate reality when Luke introduces Mary Magdalene in chapter 8 for the first time, kind of where we meet Joanna. But in chapter 7, we've met this woman that's unnamed, that is the woman that sort of anoints his feet, and she's got all these demons, and Jesus heals her. And the way Luke writes the story, you can almost connect those two, even though it's not necessarily the case. But tradition has often connected those two stories. They may well just be different stories. So there is no indication that Mary is this woman of sin. She may be more of a victim, someone that things have happened to. She had demons, perhaps, because there's other spots like in Mark as well, where she's mentioned as having been cured of different demons. But it doesn't necessarily mean she's this woman of sin that, tradition is ascribed to her. And I would say she's just not. She's just not. So then we come to the famous scene at the end, okay? And this is in John's account of her in the garden. And when she, in her grief, okay, is unable to see Jesus, right? She sees him, but she doesn't recognize him. She's just so lost in her feelings, okay? And then it's one word when he says her name, and then she recognizes him. And it's this beautiful, absolutely powerful, one of the most powerful, pieces of scripture. But then there's something really poignant that happens right after. Jesus says, Mary, don't cling to me. And there's different ways that language is used. Now, some people think maybe she was doing what any of us would do. When she recognized Jesus, she gave him a huge hug. Okay? Or maybe Jesus was just seeing inside and recognizing that she was holding on to him. But this story is one that sort of demonstrates that in our sorrow, in our joy, all of our feelings and our experiences of grief, joy, all of it, none of it lasts. So don't cling to it, Jesus is sort of saying. Don't cling to me. You have it, there's work to do. He's sort of instructing her, even as he's loving her. He is not pushing her away. He's calling her to that commitment that he knows she has. Because she, in John's gospel, is the first evangelist. She is the one that goes and tells everybody else. She's in a very powerful position. But that interaction with Jesus and her is one that's sort of immersed in grief initially and then moves out of grief. And so we'll look at some of that because it's a very powerful move that she makes. So those are sort of my background notes. One of the things I asked last week, and I don't want to take maybe too much time on this, but if anyone had, the end of our class last week, there was the question, how do you share your faith? And it was, for some, it was like, oh, I do it this way. But then some of us were really thinking on it. And I wanted to just find out, did any of you discover surprising ways, or did you remark on ways that you shared your faith this week?
I did that last week. Last week.
Yeah, this was from last week. So I don't know, did anyone remark on anything, or even if you hadn't focused on it all week, does anything come up for you now? How do you share your faith? Marcia?
I let people know that I depend upon God, or I pray to God.
So you tell them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's one way. Marcia tells people. She'll tell people about her prayer life or about how what she believes in. She'll share that. Excellent. What other ways? Morning.
I often talk about the meaning of the congregational connection, the spirit of our church connection. When I talk to people in terms of meaning in my life, people often say, what keeps you going, or why aren't you down? And I often talk about the presence of the church body in my steadiness of morale.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me, it feels like an earthly manifestation of the love of God.
Yeah, that happens through relationship and community. So it's really that deep sense of community that fills you, that then you share. But yeah, it's like we have an extended family here that holds us.
And then I ask people to come to church with me.
Excellent. A+ answer.
Start.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Bob got the star last week. Horty's angling for it this week. I don't know. Can we get it?
And I've tried to listen. I've tried to listen to his performance, but it hasn't been posted yet.
So what?
The last week's Bible study hadn't been posted yesterday.
It hasn't been linked to the website.
Yeah. So Bob wanted me to listen, and I couldn't. So I don't know what his A+ performance.
Don't
was.
tell her yet.
No spoiler alert. Bob's asking for no spoiler alert.
Okay. How about anyone else? I want Barbara.
My bridge partner comes to Larry Schaefer. He's not a
Yeah.
member, but he comes every Sunday. But I usually ask him on Thursday when we play bridge, are you coming to church on Sunday? And he comes.
Okay, so Barbara uses guilt and shame. She invites. And you know, with Larry, it's a beautiful example because it's someone that's like within a different circle, perhaps. But in some ways, Larry was one of the first people I met here.
Really?
Because Nancy Bickford,
Yeah.
before I started here,
Yeah.
his wife
Right.
was going through her last days.
Yeah.
And so I did a memorial service and we just developed a connection. And he came to church for a bit and then, stayed more connected to other circles. But I think always had a sense of, an open heart to a place like this. And he comes regularly.
Yeah.
But inviting is so key.
Yeah.
Maybe, not necessarily shaming, but if we have to. But it's just a sense of these things that we do that are outward. A lot of us are a little bit guarded about our faith. And I'm not telling them it's not that we're converting people, but evangelizing means sharing that which is important to us. And all of you have named some of those things. And how do we pay attention to that? I think becoming better sharers of our faith and better acknowledgers of the way we already are doing it is a key to us continuing to grow and thrive in our faith and as a community. Because it's about, when someone comes up and asks you, what is it that you love about your church? Or what would you say in one sentence about your faith? And most of us would be like, it's hard. Having that readiness is cultivated by, kind of articulating and noticing the ways that you're already doing. So then it's just like, yeah, here's some of the ways. I'm not worried about saying this is all the ways I do it. Here's some of the ways I did it. Okay. If there aren't any other comments about the scriptures we talked about and characters, we can go into the Luke passage to get into Joanna.
Dan,
Bob?
I'm trying to get my hand in the picture.
Oh, I see it now, yeah.
So the one thing I love about our church, and it's in this, I don't know, the philosophy of our church is we don't necessarily take the Bible literally, but we take it seriously.
That's an important part. And it's a type of distinction that a lot of us don't understand what it means until we get into it. And maybe we do studies like this. But that's it. That's how learning happens. It's not about concepts and just saying, yes, we take the Bible seriously, but not literally. No, we need to practice what that looks like. And then we'll say, oh, wow, now I see that the Bible is rich and it's gray. And it's got all sorts of tendrils and wonderful, sprouts that go this and that direction. There is not one singular path through it. There's not one singular way of articulating its beauty and its meaning. So it opens us up to seeing it as the poetry that it is, which allows like, wow, a whole, bursting forth of meaning, not a singularity. And that's true. So good. I hope that's how all of our Bible studies, obviously including this one, are playing out. Could I have someone from the online crew read this first passage, the Luke chapter 8, verses 1 to 3? This is the Joanna passage. It's not much, but we'll get us started. 40. Thank you.
Give me a second. I had it all ready here. Now just give me half a second. Okay. This is Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. Soon afterward, he went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from 7 demons had gone out. Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their resources. I misread that. Susanna and many others who provided for them out of their resources.
Yes. See, this is a big statement. These are women of means. Okay, these are women that had some resources to share. Now, in Joanna's situation, it seems like her resources were at least in part provided for by the position of privilege that her husband enjoyed in Herod's, ring of power. It doesn't really specify where. It says a steward. Okay, that could be a lot of different things. So, one of the questions to consider is, as you watch what it says Joanna's doing, she's getting on board with Jesus. He healed her. She's part of the movement now. How might her actions have affected the position of her husband with Herod?
That's what I thought.
Yes.
That's what I
Jane said that question came to her too, and maybe it
Yeah.
came to some of you. What was at stake here? Again, Luke doesn't talk about any of this, but it's there. There's no question it's there because we've already seen what Herod's attitude is towards Jesus. Anyway, let's play it out. What are some of the risks? How might her actions, Joanna's actions, have affected her husband in Herod's court? Jane?
To me, the fact that my version says they were traveling through some small cities and small towns. So she chose to travel with this band of Jesus followers. And even for me, if I was to say, hey, I'm ready to head out, Kurt. I don't know when I'll see you again, but I'm really following this guy and I'm headed out. And I'm sure he'd be going, what? I don't think, when you're in a marriage that you have that freedom to just up and take off without some, collaboration with your spouse about it.
Bingo.
And
Bingo.
and the fact that her husband was in the circle of the dignitaries court or whatever of
Mhm.
Herod, he probably wasn't thrilled, her husband. Herod probably wasn't thrilled about it. And so there could have been a lot of issues surrounding this that I thought.
Let's just say it. I have a feeling Herod would have been murderously unthrilled about all of this if he had found out. He's not gonna play that. That is a real threat to his authority. That is someone within ranks.
Yeah.
Who is basically, it's treasonous, essentially. And for those also great recognizing on the personal level, how would this have really worked? Yes, even in a patriarchal society, he would not have just sort of let his wife go off and do things typically. It is a meaningful statement that she does go off and travel with and support. So she's giving her body, her mind, her heart, and her resources to this person who healed her, who healed her, who made her whole. Something was missing. Her infirmity is not named, but she is made whole by Jesus, and she goes with that. That's a huge step. It's a huge step. That's what healing means. We talk about this, but we can see it. Healing doesn't always mean cure of disease. It means discovery of purpose sometimes. It means discovering the strength to step into your full identity. Maybe it's the case that Joanna was one of those people who wasn't really recognized outside of what her husband's job was. Heck, the way she's described it is, oh, here's Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the blah, 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 in Herod's court. It's named that way. Maybe it was because Jesus saw her, healed her, that she was able to step into her full potential. So healing, in a sense, is more than the physical aspect. It's more about where does it lead us? What does it nudge us to become? What does it give us inspiration to release sometimes to release those demons that have a hold on us, and then to move forward in a different way, along a different path. With that definition, how have you been healed by Jesus? Not just physically. What has been your experience of any kind of healing that Jesus has provided to you? Deep thinking is really a part of healing and wholeness.
Forgiveness.
We have a hand here, Marsha.
Knowing and feeling loved. And so whoever has not have come short of that in my life
Yeah.
and made me feel maybe dismissed or not important, I've been healed in that I am, because
Yes.
I am loved.
Coming to a place of acceptance that you are loved and lovable is a place of deep healing for many of us. Cecily's not with us, but she shared very openly a few weeks ago of just the power of the healing when she discovered her voice and that her feelings about things matter. They just matter. It seems like such a small thing, but it's huge, because so many of us go through our whole lives not being seen, not being heard, not being fully known. And a church is worth its salt. And I'm not trying to compare, but our angle ought to be to nudge one another towards that, to create the space that at least allows the possibility for that kind of knowing to happen. That's all. You can't force it. People need to feel safe. They need to feel comfortable. They need to grow that way. There's a lot of factors here, but it's part of it. And we try to create these spaces where that kind of healing can be known. This is some of the healing that Jesus can provide many of us. And again, physical healing is wonderful. But there's so much more richness within the idea of healing. In the scriptural texts, healing is more often about a readmittance to connection and community. Those who are outcast, those who are isolated have now been brought back in, based on their infirmity, whether they're lepers or demon possessed or all that. Healing brings them in. It brings them to a deeper connection, and people are aware, or they're aware of that they have a role. Anyone else? We can talk about just the idea of ways that you've experienced healing, or yes, Marilyn.
Something very similar where I found my voice quite recently, and Dan knows many more of the details than I'm going to share today. But I had joined a Bible study group in the senior community where I have recently moved. And we had 2 sessions where we just left the Bible passages that were supposed to be studied behind, and instead really started confronting and pushing each other about specific beliefs and finding support for one side and the other, finding support in the Bible, and then the other side finding support for their side. And I just got more and more upset, but I just sat there quietly. So in the week following the second time this happened, I started thinking through and praying about how could I help to turn this around? We had our Bible study and it wasn't like that at all. And I thought, how could I help us focus on what was there in the Bible and then build on one another's ideas rather than pushing at each other and being confrontational and argumentative. And all of a sudden, I started getting some ideas after talking to Dan and with my good friend Bruce in Santa Barbara and a couple of other members in the group who felt the same way I did. Their beliefs don't match mine, but we didn't get into that. They felt the same way about what had happened. And so I spoke up right at the beginning of the next session. And I said that I so wished that, or hoped that we could focus on the Bible passages that have been selected for us, and that we could build on one another's ideas rather than otherwise. And the session that immediately followed was just like I hoped it would be. It was just wonderful. We did build on each other's ideas. We did focus on that particular place in the Bible that the person leading the Bible study had chosen for us to focus on. And I felt so good inside that I didn't sit there quietly this time. And I was really able to express some ideas that I had.
Yeah, that is so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Marilyn. To me, it's an illustration of you living out the famous Isaiah story, that passage where it says they shall beat their swords into plowshares.
Yeah.
This idea that we need not use, say, the Bible as a weapon, but
Mhm.
when we can name it and utilize it in ways that are more like a plow or that which tills the soil, it doesn't mean that we all have to agree about how that tilling happens or what it churns up in us, but it means that we allow for that to happen without needing it to be a certain way, and we beat each other over the head about it, and then we lose all that rich possibility of connecting more deeply in the seeing and the knowing of each other, because that's what it is. This isn't about knowledge. This isn't about stuff we take in so we can be super smart and prove ourselves to God. It's about love and relationship and building on that. Our study is always pointed in that direction. You know, if we're not getting to that place, if we're not at least approaching it, then we're missing what the point of all this is for. And look, I miss it. We all miss it. Okay, it happens. We miss it in these classes sometimes, but we're angling, we're trying, we're working, we're churning that sort. And I hope that we're allowing, the growth to happen where it needs to. But what you just named is such a beautiful kind of nudging in that direction.
Well, and I really felt like God was really behind all of this, because the ideas had just suddenly come to me when I couldn't sleep because I was worried about the whole thing. And all of a sudden, these ideas came and they were so, I didn't talk very long. I didn't really have that much to say. I felt like I was able to really just pinpoint where some suggestions for how we could do it differently.
Yeah. Well, you made a great team, you and God, right there. And it seems like it opened up some new avenues for that study. And that's beautifully done, because it seems that people really resonated with that.
Mm-hmm.
If there's nothing else specific to Joanna, I'd like to move us to Tamar, which is the passage 2 Samuel chapter 13. We're not going to read the whole passage. What I assigned is just 10 verses, but there's this, I kind of went through most of the story, so I think we'll just read this, and then people have questions, we can address it. But would someone from the room please read 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 10 to 20. Oh, I hear such clamoring, I can't pick. With so many people calling out saying they want to read.
Take my mask off.
Okay, Joe, thank you very much.
The
10 to 20.
Then Ammon said to Tamar, bring the food here into my bedroom so I may eat from your hand. And Tamar took the bread she had prepared and brought it to her brother Amnon in his bedroom. But when she took it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, come to bed with me, my sister. Don't, my brother, she said to him, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you. But he refused to listen to her. And since he was stronger than she, he raped her. Is that the end?
20, yeah.
Oh, 20, okay. Then Ammon hated her with intense hatred. But in fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, get up and get out. No, she said to him, sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you have already done to me. But he refused to listen to her. He called his personal servant and said, get this woman out of here and bolt the door after her. So his servant put her out, bolted the door and after her. She was wearing a richly ornamented robe, for this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore. And Tamar put ashes on her head, tore the ornamented robe she was wearing. She put her hand on her head and went away, weeping aloud as she went.
And then verse 20.
Oh, and then her brother Absalom had said to her, has this Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart. And Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman.
Yeah. This is not a happy ending story, and I'm not going to pretend to make it one. I explained that all too often in scripture, the stories of horrific actions and violence toward women are sort of incidental to the larger narrative that often pertains to a more powerful man. And it's an illustration, in this case, of the fall of David's house and the lack of morality, that sort of thing. The story attempts to speak on her behalf, but the reality is she articulates the truth and is denied that voice or the hearing of it or the actions that support it. She, as a daughter of the king, a virgin daughter, I mean, my gosh, even just on that level, kings, that's a chess piece in the sociopolitics of the day. You have a virgin daughter, you marry her to someone else to build your kingdom. That's a position of potential power. It is just thrown away. She cries out and no one speaks for her. That's the story. Her brother Absalom names his daughter after her. I don't know what to make of that. It certainly doesn't make up for what she didn't receive from anyone in her household, that it was in a position to stop it. So one of the questions then, because there's not a good answer, okay, there just isn't. And again, this story is not necessarily meant to be about her, but we need to consider her and hear her. And so one of the tough questions then is, when have you cried out for help and no one came to your aid? And how did you deal with that? Especially when you cried out to God and you didn't experience God coming to your aid. Some of the greatest stories in the Bible are about that very thing. The laments in the Psalms, in Jeremiah, in Job. The sense of God's absence is a powerful, profound part of the faith journey. Okay, and I say it very intentionally. It is part of the faith journey. If we do not feel God's absence, we will never know God's presence. So, can you think those places that you just cried out, didn't feel or know the presence of God or the presence of a dear one who should have been your advocate? How then did you move through it, whether in your faith or in your relationship? I understand it's a big question, and I understand it's a very sensitive, potentially question. So I'm not digging. I'm very respectful of, if you want to share only a small portion or not at all, that's okay. But figured I'd open. I see Bob's hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a very personal question, and I'll volunteer to speak up. When I was about to lose my student deferment in Vietnam, my father was a career Air Force officer. I told him I wanted to be a conscientious objector. He told me I'd never step foot in his house again. And I think I felt quite abandoned at that moment.
It just gave me a rush of grief, Bob, to hear that. Thank you. Yeah, that's real. And in a time like that, a time of crisis, and I'm not here to stand in judgment of your father, but there is no question that hearing those words from someone you love, your protector, your family, your father, it's devastating. What?
prior to his death, my late husband had a downward spiral of his health. And there was no particular understanding of what was causing that. And like everything, it probably had multiple components. But he was certainly very depressed and very abandoned himself, I think. And I wanted so much to do anything I could to be of any kind of consolation or assistance or hearteningness. And I remember saying to him, I don't know what this means, but I know we can get through this. Don't let go of my hand. And within days of that, he had suicided. And because he was a man of valor in so many ways, I often regretted that I did not ask him to promise me that he wouldn't let go of my hand. But because I had asked for God's guidance in how to somehow be of assistance in this onward decline and spiral, I felt pretty, certainly disempowered, certainly not inspired, certainly not, I can't say I didn't feel heard, but I certainly didn't feel responded to.
Much thank you for it's very another Williams example. You know, much like in the story where Tamar is silenced multiple times, going through a relationship with a loved one that ends with suicide leaves us in that place of feeling silenced and abandoned and often questioning at anything because all we have are our thoughts and maybe what we could have done, even though cognitively we know. Maybe people tell us all the time, there's nothing, it's not our fault. We know that. And yet the questions come up. But we're at our most vulnerable, just before we fall asleep, you know, sometimes like that. And it just keeps us up at night. We're not consciously trying to think of these questions, but they end up being the kind of questions that just drive us bad, or they drive us to silence or despair. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm allowing us to talk like this because I know that this isn't the end of it. But to be able to speak like this, it's really meaningful. Because this is the stuff that ends up shaping the people we become. And not just in church, certainly in church, but in our lives and how we relate to others going forward. These are deep. They're often places of deep woundedness, but there's also deep healing. Because part of my question was when we go through these, how did you manage to move through it? Are you still moving through it? You know, someone, I think it might have been Bob, mentioned the word just forgiveness. When I talk about, you know, how do you understand, you know, the presence of God, or how did you share your faith? Forgiveness is one of those things that is not a one-shot deal. To learn forgiveness in a situation like what Ori just named, it's an ongoing thing. It's often incremental, and sometimes they're backsliding, which is part of the deal. And we beat ourselves up far too often in the church because we think, well, if you're a Christian, you need to practice forgiveness. And if you're not practicing forgiveness, you're not a Christian. I don't know anyone in this room or on the computer who think like that or have been taught like that. But we do sometimes receive that message. And there are places that sort of are a little bit more hard line in the way we are living our lives and in faith's role in it. So to be able to name these places of deep feeling lost or silenced or hurt or wounded and not being fully arrived yet are the places where, to me, these are the ones that Jesus steps into. Sort of like what I was talking about on Sunday when I said, you know, the whole idea of the Beatitudes being a God's recognition of having favorites. That it's when we go through these times and we're open and honest about it, that's when God is able to step in. I use the wet sponge analogy too much, but it's applicable again. Only when we are wet, Only when maybe our tears make our sponge supple can we actually receive more water of the life-giving kind. It's to speak like this is not to wallow in our masochism, but it's to recognize that our lives are not solely defined by that. They are shaped by that. But then there are other things that can step in when we see it and we name it and we know that we're not alone in it. No one can know exactly what each one of us has gone through. Each one of us has a tale to tell that is very, very heartrending and powerful. And yet we also have the places where the scarring and the healing have moved us forward. And we found some measure of wholeness again. Maybe never fully whole, but we're moving towards it. That's part of the story of Tamar and the legacy of Tamar. It's not an easy one, but it's one that's important. And it also opens the question, how can the church be a place of sanctuary and or even liberation from these places of deep pain or silencing? How can the church do it? How might the church be a place where it can actually move us forward? How have you experienced it? To move us forward through these places of pain, absence, loss. Because it's funny. Some people, when they go through the worst of the worst in life, they pull away from places like church. They pull away because their whole attitude about church for too long was, well, church is where I go when everybody's happy. And it's just where I can be my happy self. Because that's what I want to feel. I'm not pointing fingers. This happens. We want to feel a place that we can go, that we just feel happy. But life isn't always happy. And so if we can't feel comfortable coming to church when we're not happy, which many of us can't, then we often pull away when we go through the worst of times. And we find ourselves struggling. Yes?
You go to church to get some help.
You can go to church to get some help. So what does that help look like? How does the church be that helpful place? You know what the ways that are not so helpful. What have you found to be helpful about church?
Helps you get over the problems that you have
How?
by praying.
Okay, so prayer and with prayer and community. Sometimes things cannot be responded to beyond, on levels outside of prayer. Sometimes it's just prayer and it's a recognition that we don't have all the answers. That's what prayer is. Sometimes prayer is about letting go of the need to find answers. What other ways can church be that place of discovering voice, of finding healing, of moving us forward to these places of pain and loss in the lives? Ken, and then Marilyn, and then Carol.
I thought the sermon on Sunday was one that I wish that we had a church full of adolescents to hear.
Yeah.
Because that message of what it being for different and honoring those who are different is a powerful message to many young people. And I know I struggled with it when I was an adolescent, and to know that you're accepted for who you are and that God loves people who are different.
That our church could strive to be a place where adolescents and middle schoolers and all of us, but that being the place where difference is often just seen as such a tension, where we can discover that place of deep acceptance and being loved for who we are exactly, no questions asked, no matter the color of our hair, or if we wear goth makeup, or if we have nose rings, and all that stuff. If none of that matters, and we can find that place of acceptance, that's something. That's huge. And that's a big yes for me too. Thank you, Ken. Marilyn and then Carol.
I find all the things that other people are saying, the sermon often really and miraculously addresses exactly what I needed to hear that day. But I also get so much out of singing the hymns. There's something about singing that just engages so much in my body, and a lot of it is beautiful. And when I'm struggling with something or trying to figure something out, the beauty of singing can really help me.
Yes,
So there are a lot of parts of the service that just
absolutely. I think they all speak to
where
us.
I am.
Uh-huh. And sometimes it's the prayer, the public prayer, the silent prayer, all sorts of ways. And I want to say this, if I had a goal about singing as a pastor, my goal in church would be to create the kind of place where the worst singers feel invited and wanting to sing. Because the beauty of a song is not about the tone, it's about the participation, it's about the place from where it's sung.
Mhm.
In my last church, I had a friend named Mark who was 6'8" and loved to sing more than anything else. And he had the voice of a moose. He sounded horrible. And it was awesome because he sang louder than anybody. And he would tilt his head back and sing just loud because he didn't care. Actually, he did care. He wanted to do it because he said, that's what I'm able to do. I can't change the fact that I can't really hold a tune. He says, I look like I'm singing the loudest. I try not to be the most loud. I don't really know if that was actually his practice, but the point is he gave his full self to it. That to me is one of, if we can cultivate a place like that of acceptance and encouragement, that's beautiful. And to me, I don't care if it sounds crappy by any definition. If people are participating, it is nothing else than beautiful. That's it. That's it. Carol, thank you, Meryl.
I remember after 9/11 how churches were packed.
Yes.
And I don't think anyone went there for an answer because they knew there was no answer. I think they needed to feel the community.
Mhm.
And I don't know, Dan, what sermon you had or message you had that day, but our pastor basically said, I don't have any answers. I'm grief stricken like all of you, but us being here together is God's work.
I was in seminary when that happened. And it was really at the beginning stages of having cell phones. You know, some of them had them. So we didn't just call each other and stuff. We just, the friends and the students, we just all ran out to the main quad and we got into a big circle and it became a wailing circle, essentially. I wasn't the most comfortable with that, but it felt so raw and true, where people were just crying, basically, and screaming and letting it out because none of us had words for it. None of us had a way of understanding or accepting or explaining it. I mean, it was the day it happened. But you're so right in that what emerged out of that time was a deeper sense of wanting to find community, depth of something that takes us to a different place. Because somehow there was a recognition that the way we're going in the world isn't working. And somehow being a part of community of meaning helps move us out of those rutted type places. That's what often happens. And crisis does do that. It does lead us to want to find things. Interestingly, COVID has been the type of crisis that has not quite played out that way. It has driven us to a sense of longing for community, but has also created a wedge for many of the traditional ways we've done community, like physically being in each other's presence. Now, it's opened up tons of doors. We're able to do a Bible study because of, essentially, COVID kind of got us into a different way of thinking about it and gathering. So that's not all bad. It's not all bad. But what we've also seen is it's a crisis that has moved us toward a sense of longing for connection and community. But certainly we're not there yet, or that there's something that's shifting. So there's something shifting now in the way we do community. Thank you for that, Carol. Courtney?
This sort of goes back, Dan, to the question you asked previously, how has Jesus healed me? And what came up for me was that, especially through our Bible studies and doing a little more study of the words and times and actions of Jesus, there's a consistency, of course, in his returning to a place of humility and kindness and generosity and the things that we say when we say that he is our way shower and we strive to live a life like Jesus. And in doing several years of this Bible study, returning his consistency in being that person, that being. And in our study, we return to that. We return to that. We return to that. And he's always there. He's always that same being. And we return to it. And we go off and live our life, and something happens that hurts us or makes us feel proud or makes us feel any number of the emotions that as humans we feel. And we come back to Jesus, and we come back to Jesus, and we come back to Jesus. And he's always there in that place with just being essentially, exactly, specifically who he is. And it's a touchstone for us to always return to. And I would say that has been a healing place for me, because in my family of origin, there was a lot of inconsistency of emotion, like a lot of walking on eggshells. So I didn't know what to expect ever. And so having gone through these studies and always had the consistency of returning to that place of humility, generosity, forgiveness, gratitude towards God has been a real touchstone of healing for me, I would say, throughout my life, throughout this part of my life.
And every time we return, thank you for that. Every time we return to Jesus, we're coming as a bit different. We're coming from a different angle, or we have a different thing going on in our life, different circumstance. And that there is a consistency in the love and the acceptance and the forgiveness and the encouragement that Jesus seeks to provide, that I hope encourages us to know we're not forsaken, we're never given up. Jesus doesn't give up on us. So it's that sense of own it. Accept that this is what's happening to me. Too often we approach our lives like, I want to hide that. I do it. I don't share it. And then it becomes a source of infirmity in one way or another. Look, we cannot.
I find myself saying, here I am again.
Yes. And that statement is one of faith. That's a faith statement. We cannot rescue Tamar from this story. Okay? The story we read and the experience that she had, the horrors that she experienced, they happened. We can't change that. But perhaps in the way we live our lives, the way we express our lives, the way we become in church, and what we do in church, who we are, maybe that will be one of those places that helps to prevent the next Tamar from happening. Or that offers a place of voicing, of healing, of holding, of hope. That's the key. To know that we want to be that place. You know, some people come to church and it's a social club. That's not bad. It's just not very large. You know, it's not very large. The voices and the experiences of the Tamars of the world challenge us to allow church to be that place where their story is honored or given voice, that it may not have to happen like that again. Let's move to the John passage. Thank you, everyone. And let's cover the story of Mary Magdalene. It's a very well-known one. I broke it out into a couple different passages here because we're fairly familiar. Would someone from online read John 20 verses 1 to 3, and then I'll ask someone in the class to read 10 to 18. I'm pretty creative, huh? So yeah, someone online read John 20 verses 1 to 3, please. Thank you, Carol. Go ahead. This is the tomb story. Oh, if you're reading, Carol, I thought you were just looking it up. You're still muted.
I'm sorry.
There you are. Okay.
Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb.
Excellent. And then someone in the room, 10 to 18, Marsha.
So the disciples went away again to their own homes. But Mary was standing outside the tomb, weeping. And so as she wept, she stooped and looked into the tomb. And she beheld two angels in white sitting, one at the head and one at the feet, where the body of Jesus had been lying. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and beheld Jesus standing there, and did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Stop clinging to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I ascend to my Father and your Father, and my God and your God." Mary Magdalene came announcing to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and that he had said these things to her. When therefore it was evening on that day, the first day of the week.
No, that's okay.
Oh.
Yeah. I know, it's just, the story just rolls. But yeah, 18.
Oh.
Did I say 20 accidentally? I did.
Yeah.
10. That's all right. That was good. It's such a powerful story. And it's so well known. And yet every time I read it, this time I'm just thinking, wow, this is such a powerful story about grief and what grief enables us to see or not see at different times. It's both grief that I think shielded her eyes from seeing Jesus, and grief/love that opened her eyes to seeing him at a time. And I wanted to ask you, how have your own experiences of grief either shut you off from an awareness of God or opened you to a deeper sense of God's presence in your life? Is it always both? Or does it tend to be both? Or just one? How has grief either closed you off or opened you up to an experience of the presence of God, or of Jesus in this case? Why do you think, what is the purpose of grief from a faith perspective? What can grief and loss, how do they open us to faith? Or how do they shut it down?
Makes us dependent upon God.
Okay, Ken brought up a point. Yeah, grief can make us humble/vulnerable. It puts us in that position of recognizing that we are not the masters of the universe. We are not self-contained. We are very reliant on much that is beyond our capabilities. We are reliant on God. So suffering and grief can make us be very aware of that. And they can also make us aware of something else too, kind of the opposite of that. So for some people, grief can lead to anger, and grief can lead to a position of feeling that God is not real, God is not present, God is forsaken you. I'm not judging that. It's one of the, there's paths that we go. And sometimes we go down one path or another only to find that we come back around. Sometimes in our lives, we go down one path and we just find ourselves continuing to go down that. What other ways have you found that grief or loss has either attuned you to faith or become an obstacle to faith? I'm asking it in different ways intentionally. That's all roughly the same question. Morty?
I don't mean to be monopolizing this day. But
All right, yeah.
the follow-up to my first story. I was going to a church at that time, and the women of that church absolutely surrounded me with acceptance, being, whether I was sobbing or laughing or dancing or crying or leaving my groceries in the middle of the store because I couldn't manage. And I felt so surrounded by the manifestation of the love of God. These women just absolutely carried me and loved me and laughed with me and sobbed with me and fed me. And it was an amazing, amazing journey. I had never, ever felt so cared for. And I absolutely felt it was the caring of God that was coming through these people.
I have no doubt. I have no doubt. And you allow that in. You know, that's part of it too, is the gracious receiver of all that care. It's not as easy as it sounds. We sound like, oh yeah, we know we need it. Sometimes it's overwhelming. And when we're feeling overwhelmed, it's difficult to receive the love and care that is often all around us. Thank you. When I was in college, I think I've shared this previously. At my senior year, I was looking for a volunteer opportunity because it was part of my degree. And I had an aunt who was very prominent in my life at that time, who was an evangelical Christian, who was, I was involved at that time with, I wanted to get involved with an AIDS project in Worcester. So this is back in 1992 when AIDS was still very, very scary. And most of the people by far who were dying of AIDS were gay men. And so it was part of this, at that time, it was just sort of a grill, you know, still, Magic Johnson, I think, had just happened. That was like 93. So that was when things started to shift. But at that point, my aunt said to me, you know, make sure you tell them that they need to let go of this lifestyle if they want to, you know, experience God's grace, if they want to be healed. I just thought that was just, I just didn't resonate with it. I tried not to be, you know, kind of like, oh, you're just a horrible person. She was. But I couldn't go there with that. And I tell you what, the first time, because I became a buddy, they needed people to be buddies with people who were dying of AIDS. And so I was a buddy to two different men who lived in Worcester, who really didn't have a lot of family because at that point they didn't have, they had friends, but their family had rejected them. All that is to say, to be there in the presence of someone else and to simply love them and to hug was one of the most healing things I've ever been a part of. And I didn't say anything about faith per se, but that hug communicated what seemed essential to me. And it goes back to what Marilyn was kind of sharing before. We get so caught up in trying to like do this with each other and use the Bible as a weapon, when what felt most real and important there was just the human connection. And not to try to, you know, judge or make it worse, you know, what they're going through. And it was very powerful for me. And that was really what kind of was one of the initial nudges for me to move where I ended up. Because it was that pure sense of compassion and wanting to be connected with people in these really profoundly difficult places in their lives that's where I felt God. That's where I felt God's presence. And it wasn't one of judgment at all, just one of love. Anyone else? Marsha?
Well, when my husband passed, I hated God. Because I thought, why would you bring somebody so perfect and so wonderful and everything was, and then take him away. And it took me, I think, 3 years to be grateful that I had this love. Um, but it just, so I understand the negative emotions that people will have. And I couldn't, and I knew that didn't sound right to me, but I thought, nah, I just have to go with it. Just God's big. Can handle this.
Yeah. Bigger than you'd been told previously.
Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't sound right based on what you'd been taught, but your life story showed you a different path. And your difficult struggle to remain open eventually helped you find a way where you never saw it. I hope that happens for everyone who goes through that sort of profound journey. But I know you said it was a 3-year journey. That's a lifelong journey for me, walking through these times in these places. Because life does kick us in the gut often. And then we're in the place of, what's my relationship with God? What's my expectation of God in that moment? Where am I finding God? Or am I just sort of writing God off? Bye, God. You weren't there for me. You're not real. This is where a lot of us who are in this room and on this computer have been in our lives at some point. All of those places. And yet still, it's possible to find our way back here. That's what he said, to return to this place where we have the chance to once again know acceptance, love, wholeness through all of the storms and the crumblings of our lives. That's a beautiful thing. Because if we stay stuck in those places, we know where that leads. It leads to just continued infirmity. It can lead to death. It squelches our life, And again, I hold in deep compassion anyone who's going through that. That's where I gravitate. I gravitate towards people like that because I love and long for them to be seen and known and held and heard and become holy. I've walked a journey with a woman here at this church for 8 years, and that's just 8 years. Her mother's walked it her whole life almost. The one of addiction and recovery and falling back off of it, going back and trying again and falling off and almost dying, driving everyone crazy, all of it. And yet what you find is I could stop. We could all stop and just give up. And for sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes that is the most loving thing. But sometimes, if we can just say one more time, I believe in you. I see you. I'm here for you. I can't solve this, but I love you. And I'll be one of your people. Maybe I'll be your only person at that time. If we find ourselves in those moments are some of the most pure and impactful moments of our faith lives that we will ever know. And they're surprising to us because we might walk out the door and meet that person. Okay? So this person I know, and some of you know her too, is in recovery again. And I'm hopeful. So there are no guarantees. But it's classes like this, it's communities like this that I hope give us the strength to sort of hold our heart up, our head up, and come back to say, I'm broken, I'm feeling that life has really knocked me on my keister. And church is one of the places that I come for the hands to get back up. Not to shy away and say, until I can pull myself up on my own bootstraps, I'm not going through the door. That's the difference. And all of these stories are women who showed profound faith and trust in that ability to discover God and healing through the worst circumstances. And it didn't always happen for them, but they articulated a faith. They said something. They stood up. They leaned into it. They weren't afraid, or maybe they were afraid, but fear was not the deciding factor. Faith was. And I hope that these stories that we've been talking about will stay with us in ways that we never anticipated. Because these are all powerful characters and they're all real in our lives today. We meet these characters all the time. And I pray that you will find them and see them and love them. Not only outside of yourself, but within yourself. Because they are all part of us. They're a part of us. And they are lifted up as powerful, beautiful examples of the walk that we're all on. Pray that the learning continues. And I look forward to the next time when we come together to learn in new ways. But I'm so thankful for all of your sharing, for your hearts, for your openness, for your faith. You bless me. I hope this class has blessed you. Until we meet again, be in the peace and love of Christ.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone who's joined.